everyone, I'm your midwife, Tanya Tringali. Welcome to the Motherwit Podcast, a show about the issues we healthcare consumers and providers face every day as we interact with the medical system. We'll talk about its blind spots, shortcomings, and share strategies we can use to feel seen and heard, no matter which side of the table we sit on. My guest today is Kristin Revere. She is the owner and founder of Gold Coast Doulas in Grand Rapids, Michigan. She's a certified birth and postpartum doula, a newborn care specialist, a childbirth educator, and she's the co-author of Supported, Your Guide to Birth and Baby. She's also the host of Ask the Doulas, another podcast you can check out. She's a mom of two and a bonus mom to one. So earlier today, Kristin and I talked about the benefits of hiring a postpartum doula. We talked about what exactly a postpartum doula does and how this may differ from other options you may encounter as you try to wade through all the noise. Also, since most people can't afford 24-hour a day, 7-day-a-week help and ultimately have to decide how many hours and which hours of the day to have help, we talked about how having a doula during the day may differ from having a newborn care specialist at night. Now, I know I've mentioned it at some point that I was a doula for a short time when I was a young mom and had recently decided I wanted to be a midwife, but I don't usually say too much because for me, it was but a brief pit stop on my journey to becoming a midwife, and it was literally a quarter of a century ago. So much has changed, and I really enjoyed this conversation with Kristin. She talked me through a lot of these changes, and I now feel better informed, and I have no doubt that you will too, whether you are listening as a healthcare consumer or you are a birth worker or healthcare provider who thinks you know what's what in the doula world. I think you'll learn some interesting things just as I did.
Thanks for having me, Tanya. I'm so thrilled to chat about postpartum support. It's my favorite topic, although I am a birth doula as well.
Yeah, I mean, look, I guess as a midwife, we're in similar boats, right? Like, I love attending births, but over the years, it just became incredibly clear that postpartum was the biggest gap in care. And I think many people know this now, except the people who need the information the most, which is the people heading towards their first birth, right? It's like, I think we're all screaming out into the world trying to get people this information just a little bit sooner. And unfortunately, from what I see, the majority of people still learn this information from their own first experience and then kind of work backwards from there and try to remedy what may have gone wrong or suboptimally from that first time. And, you know, sometimes we feel like we're just like screaming out into the abyss and not being heard by the people who need it the most.
Yes, for sure.
I want to hear about you. I actually have already heard about you because, of course, before having you on the show, I went and listened to you on a number of podcasts. And I actually think you have a really interesting and compelling backstory of how you got here. So I would love it if you would share that with our listeners. And then, tell us about your business, and then we'll kind of dive into the details of what a postpartum doula is and how people can best utilize you guys.
Well, as far as my backstory, I worked in advertising sales, political fundraising, nonprofit fundraising, and had children later in life. So I was advanced maternal age when I was pregnant with my first child and didn't know what doulas were, but I ended up switching providers, hired nurse midwives, and they gave me the care and support that I wanted with the goals for my birth and also connected me with resources in the community. But they did not let me know about doula options. And at that time, my daughter's now 14. In my community, there weren't a whole lot of doulas. And if they were practicing, it was more in the birth role at the time. So I ended up taking Lamaze classes and did all of the preparation that as a type A personality I felt was important to do. But unfortunately, I developed preeclampsia at 37 weeks, was on bed rest, was induced at 39 weeks. and had very minimal interventions. So for that, I'm very thankful. And the midwife on call helped me, navigate through options. But my daughter ended up in the NICU for 4 days with minor glucose issues. So all of the preparation for breastfeeding, taking classes, just went out the window. And with my first child, my husband has a daughter from a previous marriage, and he had experienced a NICU in the past. So he was very helpful in that process. But for me, to not have my daughter in my room and all of these visitors and lactation consultants coming in and out and, going back and forth from the NICU, it was very overwhelming. And so I ended up becoming very passionate after my daughter was born about breastfeeding education. And with my background in politics, I ended up getting elected officials and created this rally in my city of Grand Rapids. And there I met doulas. And so I ended up having kids close together per my midwife's suggestion. So I started trying about a year postpartum and got pregnant very easily, even though I was breastfeeding. And so my first call, other than letting my husband know, was to the doulas that I met at the rally and brought on doulas to my team and worked with the midwife group and really became passionate about education and advocacy. And so I signed up for a sacred pregnancy training, and also included a couples class during that pregnancy as I read Annie Delter's book called Sacred Pregnancy, and started promoting the classes while still pregnant. And then when my son was 4 months, we went to Virginia, and I was one of the first educators in the United States. And so I ended up teaching through the collective that my doulas ran. And then my students asked me to be their doula. And so I did not have any interest in being a doula myself and being on call, and honestly didn't love the idea of bodily fluids or, all of the things that come with birth, on the other side of it. And went to a training in Florida and really fell in love with that with the first birth that I attended. And so I started taking some of my students as clients, and then realized that the collective that I work with didn't really fit my personality. And having worked in many different professional fields, the clientele that were drawn to the collective weren't drawn to me. So I wasn't getting hired at the Meet the Doula events. And so I left the collective, went on my own, started a solo business, and then ended up partnering with a hypnobirthing educator and former labor and delivery nurse who's also a birth doula. And we started Gold Coast Doulas in 2015. So the agency is coming on 10 years. I am currently the sole owner. But we wanted to have that comprehensive one-stop shop for everything non-medical in the birth and baby space in our community because it was lacking. And, having had to do a lot of research when I was working in politics to find my dream team, I wanted to make it as easy as possible. So we have everything from sleep consultants to postpartum doulas, classes, and then birth, as well as we also have newborn care specialists. And we'll talk about the different postpartum related roles. But since postpartum doulas were not as popular back in those days, we ended up bringing a training to our community and had a trainer come in from out of state and hired doulas who were in that training class the month that we launched the agency. So that's how we grew. But there was so much education and awareness that was needed for that role. If people knew about doulas, it was only about the role of a birth doula. And still to this day, I feel like there's a lot of confusion between the role of a midwife and the role of a doula. So then needing to educate my community on postpartum support was a whole nother task.
Yeah, I mean, there's that layer of people not knowing the difference between a doula and a midwife, but then maybe people who have that piece somewhat under control don't necessarily understand the difference between hiring a baby nurse or a postpartum doula. So we're going to unpack a little bit of that too and kind of figure out, what's going on there when people are aware that they need some help in home, but don't really know the pros and cons of the different offerings that are out there. So we'll dive into that too. So before we get started, you made me have a question for you that I didn't know I would have, more on the business side of things, because we do have a lot of people listening who are business owners in their own right somewhere in the birth workspace, or they're healthcare providers. So I think some of this stuff gets to be interesting for some of these folks. Tell us a little bit about your growth over time, because I believe from the other podcasts I've listened to you on, you have quite a number of doulas working for you at this point. So when you talk about 10 years ago there being this incredible lack of awareness, that must have shifted dramatically for you to have as many people working for you as you do.
Yes, definitely. And so we launched with a very small team and kept bringing birth and postpartum doula trainings to grow over time. And I would say that I built the team bigger than the need for postpartum was at that time. So that we worked very intentionally to develop relationships with pediatricians, nurse midwives, home birth midwives, um, OBs, and anyone who worked in the birth and baby space to be able to refer. Physical therapists, mental health practitioners. And so, yes, the team is currently at about 26 to 27 contractors. I'm navigating some maternity leaves. But yeah, so we are large, and I expanded our area that we serve a couple of years ago. So we serve northern Michigan as well as southwest. So everything up and down Lake Michigan.
Wow,
And
that is
that's just for postpartum. We don't serve like birth support in all of the areas that we do postpartum.
that is quite the accomplishment.
Thank you, Tanya.
Are you pregnant or a new parent looking to ensure a better postpartum experience? Or are you a birth worker looking to improve your postpartum care skills? Check out Thriving After Birth, an online self-paced course by me, midwife and educator Tanya Tringali. It's 10 and a half hours of video content featuring experts in lactation, mental health, pelvic floor health, pediatric sleep issues. You also get worksheets and a workbook, as well as options to have a one-on-one session with me. Sign up at motherwitmaternity.com/thriving, and let's improve postpartum care together. Let's change gears a little bit. Tell our listeners in your own words what a postpartum doula is. So we're just starting from a base understanding so people don't have to make assumptions as we get started.
Right. So, a postpartum doula is a trained support person who can help families achieve their goals. And of course, with any type of doula profession, it depends on the scope and training of the individual doula. So, some postpartum doulas are focused more on daytime and recovery focused, and all of us support feeding. But some trainings like my own, I'm a pro doula. There's also an infant care component and an overnight aspect to the care. So if you're looking for, say, overnight postpartum support, then you would want to make sure that your doula is trained in infant care as well as mothering the mother. And my training scope allows me to work through the first year and does include multiples training and overnight, where some trainings again are focused more on 6 to 8 weeks and short daytime shifts. And so families' goals can be very different, and especially because families are still working from home after the pandemic. with remote jobs. And so sometimes clients will hire us and want coverage during times that they have a Zoom meeting or a deadline or a project. Other times, their focus is getting strong systems in the household. And so, helping get nap time established and some structure, and helping understand feeding cues and different holds. And as doulas, we support all types of feeding and parenting. And, as households can be completely different. So some families are attachment focused and are breastfeeding, others are pumping or bottle feeding. And so it can honestly vary not only day to day, but also family to family. And with overnight support, the goal is to get the family rest and again, getting those systems and structure. And if a family's breastfeeding, they can still work with an overnight postpartum doula. We would bring baby to our client or have the client come into the nursery to feed. And then we do the burping, the diaper changes, the sleep shaping. We don't do sleep training. A sleep consultant would do that later on, usually after 3 months. But we can do some healthy sleep conditioning. And if a family is formula feeding or pumping, then they have even more rest. But we are there to support whatever their goals are, as long as we are promoting safe sleep. So we do, follow all of the protocol for safe sleep, and that is important. So if a family co-sleeps when we're not there, then that is fine. But when we're in the house, we're following safe sleep guidelines.
Okay, interesting. So you've already said a couple things that I'm really interested in. One is how much I suspected had changed in doula work over the years, and you instantly hit on it. 25 years ago, when I worked as a doula, I did 4-hour shifts during the day. I don't even, unless I've just forgotten, I don't even think it was really on the table that we were out there doing nighttime shifts or even significantly longer shifts. And so that worked really well for me when I was in nursing school. It was kind of perfect. I had a newborn and I was in nursing school, and, I was able to kind of work in these 4-hour shifts during the day, and it worked for me and it worked for the clients. But holy moly, has the landscape changed. Like, I suspected that it had, but I didn't know as much as you just told me. So that's really cool. And I can now help people better understand what's out there. Rather than just telling people what a postpartum doula does, I can understand the structure of what you guys have really built into the system. So I'm pretty impressed on a systemic level with that. I also wanted to point out to our listeners that you used a word at one point that I think is so spot on, and I want to let you unpack it a little bit more if there was intention behind it, which I'm assuming there is. You were talking about the newborn and feeding and sleep, and you said structure. You didn't say schedule.
Right.
And I think that's really critical. And I talk to a lot of people about that, because when people find the type of support that I offer postpartum, that is not the typical support that you get from your in-person local midwife care, people are usually in crisis already.
Yes.
And they're so desperate that they are using words like schedule, and I'm trying to get them to backpedal. And so that's one of those things when I talk about screaming into the abyss and wanting to get people ahead of things that I think is so critical. I would love to hear you say a little bit more about how you work with people around that understanding, but then what's the more practical side of what that looks like?
Right. And honestly, it was very intentional not to say schedule. Obviously, some babies do need to be on a schedule. If it's a NICU baby that needs weight gains and feedings, then that is much different than a baby who does not have any medical need to be on a schedule. And so we do look at goals and focus on getting some systems in the household in place. And that would be support and time for the mother to bond and understanding that nap time is important to overnight sleep. Some families think that if baby doesn't nap during the day, that the nighttime is going to be a longer stretch, and that is not true. In fact, the opposite is true. So, yes, so there are just so many different ways that we can help our clients, again, achieve their unique goals.
I love that example that you just gave because that's one of those things that is like a myth that abounds. And I'm not even clear that this is something people are repeating to each other. It's just a belief that people who are desperate come to
Yes,
along the way. And there's so many things like that we find ourselves unpacking that we don't even know people are thinking. We kind of have to be one step ahead. And to me, that's the real benefit of having professionals, whoever it is that you choose, whatever their titles are, professionals who have a real vested interest in helping people through the postpartum period, because we've already seen so many things. We've seen so many people work through these issues that we know what one might be thinking when they make a choice about how they're going to handle something, right?
right. Absolutely. And there are so many other professionals that you could bring onto your team. Certainly, some families hire a nanny very early on, an au pair. Grandparents are often taking that childcare role because we're in a childcare crisis. But it is challenging to have grandparents who may be able to help during the day to do overnight shifts. They
Yeah,
need their sleep.
yeah.
And even one night with a postpartum doula or a newborn care specialist can change the mental health and overall mood for a client. And so, obviously, the more support, the better. But if the budget is tight and you just need a night of rest, then we don't have to be 7 nights a week for 3 months. It At Gold Coast, we will work with families for 2, 3 days, one night, or 24/7, and different doulas coming in the day, then come in overnight.
I think that's one of the most important things you could have said. You just said something that I wish I said more often, which is you don't have to throw the baby out with the bathwater, basically. You don't have to have this long commitment. You don't have to have the money for 2 weeks of something that's practically daily. Just one night. Build back up your strength, even for one night, and it will reset your mood. It will reset your perspective. And I think people don't think that way. We think all or nothing all too often.
Exactly. And, some doulas do require more long term contracts. So, again, as you're finding the perfect match, see, how much support would be that starting mark, what their background and experience are. My team, they're all certified, they're first aid CPR, they're background checked, and they are experienced in supporting anything from multiples to NICU babies. And we've had a lot of advanced trainings in addition to the lactation trainings that are standard for the role of a postpartum doula.
How important is it to you that people reach out to you, find you, vet you, figure out whether you guys are the right fit or not prior to the birth of the baby?
Excellent question, Tanya. So, the earlier you hire, similar to hiring a birth doula, the better the availability and the chance to match your ideal schedule with the doulas. Or in my case, sometimes we have 5 doulas working with a family. Or, with twins, I might have every doula on my team in and out of a house if they want day and overnight. And so the earlier the better, but because I have a large agency, we can often fulfill those last minute calls of I need somebody tonight to come into my home and help because I am beyond exhausted, or I just learned about you from a colleague and I need help now. And so I have found that the typical scenarios for support are easy to fill, but now that there are some fertility related insurance benefits that cover doulas, some of those benefits, like Carrot Fertility, for example, cover up to 6 weeks of care. And so if those clients find out they have the benefit, the earlier in pregnancy they hire, the better, because they're really, with Carrot especially, you can only have two doulas working with the family. And so if a family wanted 7 days of support for 6 weeks, then it would be challenging for me to find the coverage that they need after their babies arrived compared to early in pregnancy.
Why do they care how many people are involved in the care as opposed to simply saying this is how many hours of care we will cover?
There is a vetting process, and as you know, doulas are not a regulated industry. We don't have boards the way midwives do. And so some doulas that were birth doulas were doing postpartum work, and not trained and certified. So a lot of these fertility benefits requires certification, insurance, and all of the steps that my agency from day one has required of our contractors. And so they find that with the vetting and the doula sending them information, that it's better to have a small team, rather than having to vet people who are on a rotational basis who may not have the qualifications that these fertility insurance companies require.
Okay, so it sounds like they're managing their own workload because I'm looking at it from the perspective of I feel that they should just consider you one because you have already, if they can see that you have vetted everyone, then they shouldn't have to, put a cap on the number of people you bring in. But anyway, I get it. I get the point. Systems do not always work seamlessly or perfectly. Hey everyone, it's me, Tanya, your host here at the Mother Wit podcast. You know I sometimes invite my clients on the show to talk about their birth stories and postpartum experiences, but I want to tell you a little bit more about what those clients and I actually do together. I started Mother Wit to help people in the perinatal period achieve their health and wellness goals. That means whether you're hoping to conceive and struggling with high blood pressure or high blood sugar, or you're having trouble managing anxiety or depression in the postpartum period, or maybe you just need support and advocacy between prenatal or postpartum visits, I can help. Get a discount on your first consultation with me at motherwitmaternity.com using the code FIRSTCONSULT 10% off. That's 10% symbol, all one word. I'm looking forward to working with you and maybe having you on the show too. Okay, so we've talked a bit about what a postpartum doula is. I think we've kind of touched on some of this already, but just to be precise about it, what do you think the biggest misunderstandings are today about what a postpartum doula is? What is the biggest myth or two that you still feel you need to dispel?
Well, I would say, one, people, when they say that they had postpartum or want a postpartum doula, they are associating that with postpartum depression or postpartum mood disorders. And so the general public only thinks that a postpartum doula is for someone who is struggling with postpartum depression or postpartum anxiety. Of course, we have a heart and the background to identify the different perinatal mood disorders, but that is not 100% the focus for postpartum doulas. And postpartum, as you know, with your background, is a phase. It's all about that recovery time. But everyone is just short in postpartum depression and postpartum mood disorders too. Oh, I had postpartum. And so that is a big struggle. And I do want to say that we are very passionate about supporting our clients, whether it's day or overnight, who are struggling with their mental health. And so we offer $2 off per hour. as a therapy discount, whether they are in therapy as a regular maintenance or they are in a mother baby perinatal program. And so we want to make it more accessible. And so, but I would say the biggest misconception is that you only need a postpartum doula if you're struggling with your mental health.
Yeah, and I would argue that from where I sit, the whole point of any support for postpartum, especially when you get ahead of it, is to try your best to prevent those developments or minimize their impacts, right?
Yes.
So that's really what I want people to hear. And I really hadn't thought about the fact that people say what you just said people say. I hear people say it, but I hadn't really thought about it. When people say, oh, I had postpartum. We all know what they mean when they say that.
Right.
But I hadn't really thought about the impact on their assumptions about what it means to have a doula. That's what I should say more pointedly, is that I hadn't made that connection. So that's really, really important for people to hear.
And also that it is only for the celebrities or the elite, and it's a luxury service. And certainly having some of these insurance benefits or health savings and flex spending covering not only birth doulas, but also postpartum doulas, and even registering for support instead of things has made an impact on that. But there's also a lot of shame in asking for help and seeking out professionals, in that in America, we're expected to be super women and do it all and not ask for a thing. But honestly, we're meant to do this together and in community. And so doulas have always existed, but we were not a paid profession in the past.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I think we should move a little bit in the direction of talking a little bit about what it means to be or hire a baby care specialist. There's clearly this baby who I think we know kind of gets all the attention, and we're trying to steer a lot of attention back towards the mother because we know that if we mother the mother can mother her baby better.
Yes.
But with that said, I am seeing this trend. I've noticed it for quite a while now where postpartum doulas are also newborn care specialists or baby care specialists. Tell us a little bit about what that means and how that changes the dynamic of what goes on in the household when you're hired.
Yes. So I'm a newborn care specialist in addition to being a postpartum doula, and the role is very different. The goals of the family are often different. And so a newborn care specialist usually works for a set period of time, often 3 months, the first 3 months. And it could be 24/7 care for the newborn. So it's not mothering the mother, certainly offering feeding support, but it is completely focused on getting these strong systems for the newborn and helping the mother thrive by supporting baby care, whether it's triplets or one baby. And some newborn care specialists also travel with families and do live in support. And so at Gold Coast, we tend to do more of the overnight end. We do minimal 24/7 support with the same newborn care specialist or postpartum doula. So it is a bit different because a postpartum doula, whether they are trained in infant care or are focused more on that mothering the mother that you mentioned, we are supporting the entire family. So we will accompany clients to appointments if it's daytime care. We will do household tasks. A newborn care specialist will keep the nursery tidy, will wash bottles and pump parts, but they are not going to make snacks for other kids or do light meal preparation or clean up in the kitchen the way a postpartum doula would during the day.
So when you wear both hats, does that mean someone's hiring you for one hat versus the other, or do you ever, obviously your training comes into play every moment in both ways, but from listening to that answer, it's making me feel like someone has hired you for one or the other. Is that the
Yes,
case?
usually the case.
Okay,
And
okay.
with my agency, if they're looking for overnight care, it's more of focusing on baby
Mm-hmm,
versus the
mm-hmm,
entire family.
mm-hmm. Okay, got it. So that's kind of where a discovery call ahead of, being desperate comes in, right? Is really understanding what kind of care do I want to pay for?
Right, exactly.
So now we're really getting into exactly where I wanted to land on this. How do you help people? I guess, especially, you probably do this every day in terms of a discovery call where somebody's calling to inquire about your services. How do you unpack for someone? Because in a perfect world, people could probably utilize both and be very happy.
Right.
Day, night, baby care, postpartum doula, all of it. Like, give me all of it. But most people can't afford that. So, how do you help someone figure out what is right for them?
Yes, and certainly that intake call and matchmaking and finding out what their goals are, the type of support that they're looking for. Is it day or overnight or a mix? And matching them with the perfect newborn care specialist or postpartum doula for them based on if they're looking for twin care or overnight, or again a mix of day and night. And if they want days, they're usually getting the role of a postpartum doula because it's more focused on, again, recovery and doing some of the help around the house, or attending a pediatrician appointment, for example, and being able to even run an errand for clients. So that is much different than a newborn care specialist.
So, on that note, what would be the difference? And do people ask you this question, or am I kind of out of date here? What's the difference between a newborn care specialist, not in terms of training necessarily, because we don't need to go down that road, I don't think, but in terms of what someone gets out of the experience if they hire a newborn care specialist versus hiring a baby nurse or a night nurse?
Yes. And so a lot of the terms of, certainly baby nurse, especially, but night nurse, night nanny, the newborn care specialist field has replaced those titles. And a night nurse is not necessarily a nurse. We have a team that some of our team members are RNs, but they don't act in the scope of a nurse when they're in the postpartum role or the birth doula role. And so, yes, so the field has changed a lot. A night nanny may just be a nanny with no training on newborn care or feeding support. They are often less expensive than a trained professional, but a newborn care specialist is going to understand a lot of the newborn conditions in a way that even a postpartum doula wouldn't. So, colic, for example. And so their studies are longer than a 2 to 4 day postpartum doula training in newborn care conditions, multiples. And so, if they're looking for a specialist in baby, and want more long term support, than a newborn care specialist, or a hybrid of a postpartum doula like we offer and an NCS could also be an option. And if you are looking for just help, someone to be there, then a nanny who offers overnight care might be the most affordable option.
Mm-hmm. So, since you explained to me that people hire you to wear one hat or the other, I'm assuming it's also the case, though, where somebody might request a mix of those things but understand that they're happening at different times. So, for example, Can I have a postpartum doula come for X number of hours, X number of days a week, but can I also have a newborn care specialist come and spend the nights with me? Do you have that often?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Very
Okay.
frequently.
Got it.
And we have postpartum doulas on our team who are also certified lactation consultants.
Mm-hmm.
So when I'm matching potential doulas with my client and showing them their bio, they might really like the feeding background or the fact that a doula is also a nurse, or has different skill sets beyond their role, even though they're hiring them for
Mm-hmm.
one role only.
Mm-hmm.
And so,
Mm-hmm.
if our postpartum doula, outside of offering basic lactation support, was needed for a lactation visit, then that would be billed differently
Mm-hmm.
and after the shift ended. So there is a bit of a difference in roles with professionals who have more than one skill set.
Interesting. So I'm curious if you have thoughts about regulation as it pertains to the doula profession.
Yes, I mean, Medicaid coverage for doulas have certainly changed. Some of the requirements, and I am for having a board exam or some sort of continuity within the profession
Mm-hmm.
because doula training organizations are so different in scope.
Mm-hmm.
And in the past, there were so many lay trained doulas or birth doulas who felt like they didn't need to take a postpartum training in order to do postpartum work or be certified. Many doulas would just train and decide not to certify or keep a certification. And so I am for progress in the field. It is definitely similar to midwifery, a heated subject, but the more opportunities, including Medicaid coverage for birth doulas and insurance coverage, do require more regulation.
Yes, I actually wholeheartedly agree with you on that front. And I think, look, as far as midwifery is concerned, I do think the majority of people support regulation at the level of care we are providing. I would hope that
Yes.
people understand why that's really critical. But I think that it would eliminate a lot of confusion and it would at least create a bar, right? Of like minimum basic skills. If all the different agencies are going to roll their material out in different ways, which should be permitted, just like there are many midwifery programs around the country. We all have to teach a certain amount of information, but how we teach it is what's up to us. We have a
Yes.
responsibility as educators to cover all this content, but I can do it this way and you can do it that way. That's kind of where it should be so that people understand what they're getting. And again, this is why midwifery is so confusing in the United States. I'm going off on my own tangent now, but because people don't know there's so many different kinds of midwives. How can anyone understand what we do? And what's the difference between you and
Right.
a doula and you and an OBGYN? It's like, holy moly. In my 25 years in this field, I don't feel that we've made any progress in our ability to understand this. And now we're layering in all the different types of doulas and all that stuff. So it's a minefield for folks. I think it's really challenging, and I don't really envy new parents these days trying to like wade through all this information. But
Exactly.
you have done a beautiful job today, helping us kind of make sense. I have learned so much, which doesn't always happen when I have guests on. Sometimes I just have like a really fantastic conversation, which this was. But today you taught me so many things that I actually knew that I've been due for an update on this topic. And I was just like kind of waiting for it to come my way. So I'm really grateful that we got to do this today. Is there anything else that you feel I've been remiss in that you're like, I need to say this to your people before we go?
Well, again, it's all about connection. Just like with hiring a midwife, make sure that not only the professional background, of the doula that you're considering hiring matches your goals, but that you feel comfortable. with overnight doula support and newborn care specialists, there's still interaction with families, especially if they're feeding babies. So yeah, just choose wisely. And there are so many amazing postpartum doulas around the United States and the world. So I'm happy to speak about this profession, and I'm so thankful that you invited me, Tanya.
Actually, I want to ask you one more question on that note. I think that you having this large agency is probably not the norm, that not every region or community has this. But I'm wondering if you have a sense of where we're at as a country. How common is a business model like yours?
Good question. So there are agencies certainly in the bigger cities. So Chicago, New York, it's Boston, certainly San Francisco to find agencies. But in the more rural areas, you might be finding a partnership with two doulas or an individual postpartum doula, for example. And I find in my book, Supported Your Guide to Birth and Baby, we talk about building that dream team, but how to find your doula. And so, Doula Match is a long running site that allows you to find not only birth doulas, but also postpartum doulas in your geographical area who are available around your due date. And it shows their certifications. And so, that is one way. And there are some newer apps like Hello Mila and that do also connect families with doulas.
I will be sure to put those in the show notes. And I actually know the name of the agency in New York City. I know we have a lot of listeners in New York City. Doula Care, run by a woman named Ruth Callahan. Shout out to Ruth Callahan, because that's who I used to work for 25 years ago.
Wow. I know her name well. Yes.
Oh, that's
Never
so
met
funny.
her.
Oh, she's amazing. And it's been a very long time since I've spoken to her, and I probably should reach out because I actually, in preparation for this episode, made sure her business was still up and running. I hear her name once in a blue moon, but I don't, again, it's just not my world anymore. It hasn't been for so long that I'm kind of a little bit disconnected. But yeah, she's still out there doing the same stuff, and I'm sure it's advanced in many ways like you've talked about, but it's changed so much. This has been really pretty mind-blowing to me, and I'm really impressed. I'm impressed with you. I'm impressed with the profession and where it's come from and where it's gotten to, and I'm really excited to see what the evolution is from here on out, because clearly there's a lot more to come, especially with this Medicaid expansion and all of this stuff. I mean, there's a lot of room to grow, and there's going to be a lot of growing pains, right?
Yes.
So as positive as it is, there's going to be some bumps in the road for us and for consumers as well. Thank you so much. Tell our listeners how they can find you and all your things, your podcast, your book. Like, take a minute and share your info.
Sure. Thank you, Tanya. So my doula agency in Michigan is Gold Coast Doulas, but we do offer some virtual services such as sleep consulting, self-paced classes, our Becoming a Mother course, birth and baby prep course, and that is thebecomingcourse.com. And my podcast is on all podcast players, Ask the Doulas, and that's askthedoulas.com. And I have my book, Supported Your Guide to Birth and Baby, is available on audiobook, paperback, hardcover, and also an ebook version, so Kindle. And it can be found at select bookstores and certainly Amazon and all of the online book retailers.
Awesome. Thank you so much for your time today. I've really enjoyed having you.
Thank you. I love your podcast, the work you're doing, and as you know, I'm a big fan of midwives, so thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Mother Wit podcast. If any of the issues we discussed today resonate with you or your experience, I'd love to hear from you. Leave me a voicemail at 917-310-0573, or better yet, email me a voice memo at tanya@motherwitmaternity.com. I really want to hear what worked for you, what didn't work, what support you'd wished you had, how you got through the tough times, how you advocated for yourself, or especially any tips you want to share with our listeners. I want to hear all of it. And if you'd really like to work together, you can get a discount on your first consultation with me at motherwitmaternity.com using the code FIRSTCONSULT 10% off. That's 10% symbol, all one word. Okay, that's all. It's wonderful being in community with you all. Thanks again for listening, and see you next time.
And remember, listeners, nothing we discuss on this show should ever be considered medical advice. Please speak to your local provider about anything that comes up in this show that resonates with you and your needs and your health care.